Yeah, it's what it's what I was talking about. So you can assume that I know the basic elements of the story, right? But the connections that you're making from one idea to another, that's where I think people most need to explain, right? Like how you logically get from point A to point B, which is usually
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write The Wars is a book about
no,
me.
exactly.
I did, but only
In the intro.
you'll see.
No, it's fine. Okay, so we'll get started. I'm not going to go into full screen just yet because I wanted to start with a clip. Hello, Kelly's. Um, before getting into today's topic, which is of course more or less going to be focused on picking up on what we started introducing yesterday and mostly using examples from uh, the second half of the wars, so parts 3, 4, and 5. Oh, good. I'm glad you made it. Does anyone have any questions from yesterday's lecture? Wonderful. So one of the things, or the main thing that we focused on was, of course, Findley's playing with history. And as is starting to become my tradition in this class, I managed to find a clip of Findley talking about his process and his relation between and his imagining of the relation between fiction and history. Right? And this is a whole interview or discussion that he had, as you can see, with Jane Rule back in 1993. And that's why everyone's haircut looks absolutely awful as it does. But it, one of the people in the audience, as you'll see, is going to ask him a question that specifically talks about the wars and how he manages to, balance those two, or fiction and history. His answer involves a little bit more of his other war novel, which is Famous Last Words. But I think the point that he's getting at is insightful, nonetheless. It's 4 minutes long. I'll play it, or his answer is about 4 minutes long, so I'll play it in its entirety, and it'll manage to bridge yesterday and today's class.
My question is to you. In reading your books, in reading Famous Last Words and The Wars, it's very intriguing, the interweaving of history and creative writer flow that you display in this book. And it's hard not to ask yourself when you're reading them, how much of this is real history and how much is your creative interpretation. And it becomes an intriguing part of the whole reading process. And I'm just wondering if you would comment about that in some way. Obviously, there's a lot of research that went into both those books as well.
Yes, indeed, but greatly interesting it was to do. I had a conversation with the American novelist E.L. Doctor, who wrote incredibly intricate novel, interweaving all kinds of realities and real people and different characters, fictional characters, we will call ragtime. And I always remember him saying, "Isn't it funny when once you declared your area?" And his was turn of the century of the eastern seaboard of North America. You become a magnet. And it literally zaps at you, and all the material comes zapping across the board at you. The minute I said the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, all that material sort of flew at me from everywhere. I couldn't open a book anywhere that didn't have a reference one way or another, because the eye begins to see. So, in other words, the research may be intricate and prolonged, but it's always absolutely fascinating and it's somewhat easier than I think it's going to be. Addressing the question of mixing one with the other I always believe in the moments. And maybe I mean the moment only, and maybe I don't. I don't really know, but I think I mean the moment only. In the moment, I believed that all fiction was true. I really did. I wrote, the Duchess of Windsor in particular, is famous last. She became a character of my own. She became a character of my invention. But everything that was put on the page about it was absolutely true. But the way in which it was presented in that novel was unique in terms of all the other ways it was presented in biographical material. And so she became a very large fictional character. And in essence, that is what she was, which is absolutely true. She made herself up. And that's what I came to know when I realized she's wonderful. I've been given this immense gift of a woman who has self-created her entire being. You have a responsibility to history, and that responsibility involves, there's the word again, the integrity of history, and the integrity of the people involved in history. And you must not cross that. But you can make up and create fiction around the truths in history that can be measurable. And it's a mode that I, in those moments, particularly enjoy using greatly. And I'm always very pleased in the prideful way of Alice. One sentence in famous last words in which man writing on the wall of Mohammed has written in writing out the story of all these writes the word. Everything I have written here is true, except the lies. And that's all right. That is the story of all writing.
I like that. I've read the novel before, but I still like that resonance between famous last words and this, right? Everything here is true except the lies. Right? And I liked his point in saying also that the character, the Duchess that he's referring to, created herself. Right? That he almost plucked her out of history in a sense, and the only fictional aspect of the novel is the way that he wrote around her, right? Or that she presented herself to him in that sense. And if we want to relate it explicitly to the wars, which of course he doesn't in that clip, one might think because the Duchess that he's referring to is an actual historical figure, he had someone that he could read biographies about, which is not the case for Robert. Robert, as we established last night, is an entirely fictional character, but it's based on historical events. So who is writing the novel, right, in this very specific sense? We talked most literally about Findley and the archivist being the narrator, but there is probably something to say if we take Findley at his word in this interview that every character in the novel is also participating in the writing of the novel itself. Obviously, Juliet Dorsey has a lot of transcripts, for example, so she's an active part of the story that's being told, even if she's not physically writing the novel. Right? And even when, according to the archivist, the transcript breaks down at certain moments and she has to recount what Juliet had originally been saying in the transcript, there is a kind of narrativization happening and a mediation between what Juliet originally said and what the archivist is remembering as important to being said in that moment. I don't know how to fit it into the wars specifically, but I do encourage you, maybe there's probably an essay in there somewhere of him, of Findley's answer when he was talking about in the moment, right? In the moment, I think this, or in the moment when I was writing, this is my interpretation of it. And since I listened to that clip last night as I was half preparing for this class, that's kind of stuck in my mind. It's one of those moments I was like, oh, interesting. When does the writing moment occur? Right? Is it simply when you are writing, or is it an ongoing process of constantly writing and reconsidering the novel or whatever work you're actually producing? Is the fact that we're still talking about this novel 50 years after its publication, 50 years after its publication, still a part of its writing? Right? Because we're reinterpreting and reconsidering and discussing and writing about it. Okay, so there's writing about writing about writing and so on and so forth, and you can keep going into infinity. And I find that kind of interesting to think about. Again, not because we're going to talk about it necessarily today, but because I think that it's worth contemplating, and this is as good of a place to do that as any. So there's a few things that I highlighted in these PowerPoints that I thought was particularly interesting to discuss, but as usual, we can maybe go into different directions based off of what you read or what you grabbed onto, which is totally fine by me. We've typically done that in other classes anyway. It was just more obvious because we were talking about poetry and less of a thick book. So one of the things that I wanted to come back to briefly was narrative structure, now that we've read the whole text, or as much of the text as we're ever going to read for this class. So I do want to insist on this, because I think it will allow us to get into the other topics, at the very least, whatever they may be. But some of the other topics that I have in mind are the ending specifically, and I have here a still from the movie. The discussion of photographs, kind of expanding on that, which we rushed through yesterday because I realized way too late that we had 10 minutes left of class. Questions of authority. The question of perception and vision, I think, is really interesting to talk about in the novel. And of course, we can talk about the title. Some of these, or most of these, we discussed to some extent yesterday, but we can go in, like I said, whatever direction. Okay, so yesterday I had drawn this little diagram, right, whatever you want, in order to represent what is typically understood as story structure, and how we had stopped exactly halfway through, right? So this is the hinge between part 2 and part 3, okay? Part 1, I guess, would be this lead up, part 1 and 2. And then we have part 4 and 5, which can arguably be falling action or the lead up to the conclusion, to put it in normal terms. And then at the end, we have probably the epilogue or the last pages. The new status quo, so to speak. And usually we demonstrate stories in this fashion in order to really emphasize what the important story beats are, right? And how they actually influence character development. Is it a foolproof schema? No. There's plenty of people that can rightfully go against it, but it does help kind of visualize how stories generally work. Okay? And the way that I talked about it yesterday, for those of you who weren't there or who don't remember, is that usually in the rising action, you kind of set up everything that you need to set up, In this case, you set up Robert's character, his going to war, and right around the hinge between 2 and 3, he's about to face a major battle, which of course happens in part 3, and he's met pretty much all the characters that he's going to meet in the story going forward. Okay? And all the themes, whether we're aware of them or not, have pretty much been set up so that when we get to the falling action, right, and the lead up to the actual explosive moments of the story, which we can argue what exactly they are, because there's a few different ones that you can maybe argue. All of those themes that were set up in the rising action now make more sense. I assume this is something you've seen in some kind of high school English class on some level? No? Okay, so some people yes, some people no. Okay. All right, so like we said, we'll say Robert Ross's setup. So in part 2, let's see, it was page 108. Yeah. Actually, if you have the physical copy, turn to that page. So it's part 2, chapter 13. So on my copy, it's page 108. It's just before chapter 3 or part 3 starts. So what I want to do is look at chapter 13 of part 2 and then briefly talk about what happens at the beginning of part 3. And as I mentioned yesterday, we'll give you somewhat of an indication because it's in the literal middle of the story of what Findley is most interested in thematically. Does anyone want to read chapter 13? It's literally just a paragraph long. Okay. I'll do it for this one.
What page?
So this is 108. The almost exact middle. Just before part 3. So on the 27th of February, Robert had finally fallen asleep close to midnight. At exactly 4 a.m. on the morning of the 28th, the Germans set off a string of landmines ranged along the Saint-Éloi salient, which is an actual battle, by the way. One of these blew up the trenches 500 yards directly in front of the stained glass dugout. The blowing of the mines was a signal for the artillery to start firing, and the whole of the countryside seemed to jump into flames. This was the beginning of the second phase of a battle the Canadians had thought was already over. But it was to rage for 5 more days. In it, 30,000 men would die, and not an inch of ground would be won. It began with Robert lying under his bunk with a rabbit, a hedgehog, and a bird. After the landmines had gone up, and after the first long salvo had been fired by the guns, there was a brief moment of silence. In this silence, Rodwell was heard to say to Livett, "Some Inuit." So, just based off of this passage, right? Some of the stuff we talked about yesterday, such as the animals, for example, Robert was lying under his bunk with a rabbit, a hedgehog, and a bird. So we get the re-emphasis right at the halfway point of this symbol that's associated with Robert. Okay. But we also get a setup of literally what's going to happen in part 3, and is going to be the main focus of part 3, which is the Battle of Saint-Éloi. And sure enough, if you turn the page to page 111 on my copy, which starts Monday, the 28th of February, 4 a.m., you start the zooming in on that battle in excruciating detail. So, while in many ways the first half, while there is some hints to explicit war, right, the training grounds and all of that, the fact that from part 2 to part 3, we are getting this hyper zooming in, or if you want to call it like a telescoping of a battle, says a lot about what Findley is actually interested in. And the fact that it is such detail about the battle, people getting blown to shreds, right? The gas that people have to encounter and have to deal with. The fact that there is, we can talk about this in more detail, the fact that there is no or not enough equipment for the men, right? They were supposed to get gas masks and they didn't because there was a lack of resources. And so they're treated like animals, literally, to come back to that. Or their safety is not considered a top priority. All of that was hinted at in the first parts and is given a concrete and exemplary form in that part, in that third part, right there. So yes, it's a zooming in and concrete examples. So usually, if you want to make an argument, by the way, about this novel for your essay this week, it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of your examples came from the very beginning and the middle. Right? That's probably where you'll find the most fruitful points of examples to pull from and analyze. Does this make sense for everyone so far? Okay. We'll come back to the ending in a second. But I wrote here on the PowerPoint beginning, middle, and end, and I put them in quotation marks. Does anyone remember from yesterday why I would do this? Right, like beginning, quote unquote, and middle, quote unquote, and ending, quote unquote.
Oscar Wilde.
Okay, so I used Oscar Wilde as an example, but he's not the one that I'm talking about in relation to the beginning, middle, and end part, though. If you'll remember, what I was talking about when I said this was that usually stories, while they technically start somewhere and end somewhere, they also have the feeling of a beginning, the feeling of a middle, and the feeling of an ending. And I'm bringing this up again here because while technically this is the mathematical middle of the story, okay, as far as page count is concerned, one could argue that it also has the feeling of a beginning. Right? It's the start of a battle, of course, on a most literal level, but it's also the beginning of Robert's downfall, right? In the tragic sense of the term. Right? Up until this point, you still feel, okay, well, he's not quite a hero in the conventional sense, but maybe there's some hope, or we still hold out hope for Robert getting out of this alive in some way, shape, or form. Spoilers, I guess, for those of you who didn't finish the novel. But what you start to see from part 3 onward is that the hints towards Robert's death, right, are beginning to show, right, a little bit more explicitly. His closeness to death on a literal level, when he sees the men around him dying, right, is made more explicit. Okay. So you get that sense of beginning. And paradoxically, it also gives you some kind of feeling of impending ending. Right? It makes the inevitable end that you're starting to see more and more clearly as the narrative approaches come into focus. So while these stories do have technical points, right, all of these are ultimately very subjective. Okay, and are based off of a sense of feeling that both Findley is creating and you as the reader are sensing, right, based off of your own interpretation and reading of the events. So one of the things that we brought up yesterday was the fact that it was rather confusing that almost from one part to another, Findley was changing the perspectives. He was going from the archivist's perspective to one character's perspective to describing a photograph, and so on and so forth. And to tie all of this together, part of what I think he's trying to do in creating this confusing narrative is to exactly highlight this. That whenever you're talking about history or the fictionalization of history, you're never quite clear when exactly a story begins or ends. Right? There's always a sense of arbitrariness to it. Right? You're inevitably going to have to go back as soon as you find a new piece of information to know where that piece of information originated. So that's why when we were talking about the now slightly different timeline, right, that was presented on this side of the class, there's inevitably a little bit also of a fabrication going on there, right? The kind of illusion that history happens in any kind of sequential order. And one of the things that Findley's doing in his narrative structure is dropping that illusion as well. Saying, really, the structure of history is as much of a fiction as anything else. And it's all about a feeling of structure. And that's, I think, why his discussion of the moment in his interview was so interesting, I think, to me. Because whatever moment you're reading in the story at that specific second that you're reading, or minute, is kind of laden with so much historical potential, both past and future, right? That it inevitably contradicts itself. Are we all good on that? Okay. I promise this is the most confusing we'll ever get in this class, right? All of the, maybe not. Well, this is the most confusing we'll get where narrative is concerned in this class, right? All of the other things are a little bit more straightforward, right? So we should be okay and safe. Does anyone have anything they want to add about narrative structure and anything that we would have talked about either yesterday or today before we move too far away from that? Or does anyone have any questions about this? Because if not, we'll get to the ending and I'll just kind of spoil it full throttle, and we'll deal with that, and it'll make the conversation a little bit more open as far as the examples that we can pull from. Okay. So, for those of you who did finish it, how would you say the novel ends? Or what would you say is the ending of the novel for those of you who finished it?
You mean like the barn burning?
Okay, so I guess my question is, where does the ending begin? It's a bit of a play on this, right? But the barn burning can be one of them, so Robert ends up in a barn with horses. I think they did that in the movie, right? Yeah, okay. So he ends up in a barn with horses, and he's told, no, leave the horses because they are expendable. And he decides to stay, and the barn is burned down with him in it. And the dog. Poor dog. The dog that is never found. Yeah, that's really the real tragedy of the wars, is not all the horses or Robert or all the men. No, it's the dog.
It's all tragic.
It's all tragic, to be fair, right? By the way, when I say tragic, do we all know when... did I almost hit it?
No.
Okay.
But you keep trying.
When I say tragic, by the way, in the literary sense, usually what that means, because we tend to overuse that term now in the modern sense because we no longer use it in the narrative sense of the term. Tragic doesn't just mean sad, right?
It's death.
But it's death, but it also doesn't have to be. Usually it's associated with that because it's a facile way of demonstrating this. But usually when we talk about tragedy in the literary and narrative sense, it's someone who is brought down, right? So that's why in classical theater, it's very often a king or a higher up person who is brought low, killed, loses their family, loses their eyes, whatever, right? So that's usually the elements of tragedy, right? A person that you think is going to succeed and then crashes down. That's why Hamlet is the quintessential example of tragedy, right? He tries and you feel for him the entire time. Oh my God, he's actually going to manage to kill his uncle who killed his dad. And he kind of does, but also he dies in the process, right? He's brought low by his attempt. And you do get that in the most literal sense here as well, right? You have your hero or sort of hero in Robert trying to reach as high of a achievement that he possibly can given his circumstances, and we can talk about that, but arguably he fails. So that's what I mean by tragic. So for you, Annalie, I guess we'll talk about it here. So you would place the beginning of the end at the barn burn. Why?
Because it's really stuck.
Okay, yeah. That fits in. Sorry, just to finish that, that fits in with the feeling of ending, right? It's a powerful moment. Okay. Say that louder. That's good. No.
When it goes back to the beginning.
Yeah. How does the novel begin?
At the end.
It begins at the end, right? And so at the very least, the novel is telling you that, the ending does begin in this or in and around that moment, right? So I guess that asks a question that we don't have to answer necessarily here because there isn't a fixed answer, but you should ask yourself, is the novel the ultimate arbiter of its own structure, right? That's what Findley wants you to read into it. And on a certain level, we have no reason to discount Findley's own construction of his own story. Right? But then we inevitably have to ask the question, okay, well, what led to the barn burning? Okay, right? Is that just as valuable of an ending or a beginning of an end? Okay. Postmodernism, ladies and gentlemen, right? Story structure is slippery.
I think that the end starts when he kills the German, because that's when he kind of breaks.
So do you want to say that a little bit louder for the class?
At the end of the third section, when he struggles through the trenches and the gun setting and the gas attack, and then he has that connection with the German, but then he kills the German, I think something breaks inside of him where he tried so hard to be noble and good and do the right thing, and then his base instincts just took over and he did what instinctively what a wild animal would do with that corner.
Yeah, good. Right. So for those of you who maybe don't remember, right, there's that moment where a German is looking at him through binoculars. I don't remember if that's in the movie or not. Right, and as Mel was saying, he decides to ultimately kill this person.
You would call it a decision.
Yeah, that
his
can
body
be
decides before his brain, just like in the brothel.
Right, exactly. Good. So there's kill on instinct. So, as far as events are concerned, we can absolutely make an argument that the events of the story start to wrap up in a nice little bow, right? Nice little bow, as cleanly as they possibly can with the burning of the barn, okay? Because things start to kind of wrap up from there. All of the characters end up in their final positions after this moment. Okay? But from a thematic level, for Robert, who's our main character, his ending, I think you're right, begins when he makes the decision or the instinct to kill. because then everything that we thought may have been possible for Robert, that he resists that urge to kill, is broken. Right? And that sliver of hope that you have in him as a character is kind of shattered by the war machine. I'm doing this exercise, by the way, and then I saw your hand. I'm doing this exercise, by the way, as a way to demonstrate that not only what I was talking about slippery endings or slippery narratives, but also we should question ourselves about whose or what's ending we're talking about, right? Are we talking about the ending of the story proper? Are we talking about just Robert's ending, right, as a character? There's all kinds of different endings that inevitably occur in a narrative. Right? And different characters or different events end at certain points. Okay. Yes, you had a question.
So was the rape actually before probably the German killing? Or do you how it starts with him killing?
So I just put it above because it happens before the barn burn.
So
here.
you think rape would be above German though? Like with that?
Well, no, because the rape happens here, right?
I thought.
Yeah, so it happens before the barn burning.
I thought it was before.
It's before the barn.
Yeah, it's before the barn burning and after the trade, because it's in chapter 5, part 9, I think, or part 5, chapter 9, something along those lines. Oh, now I'm blanking on where exactly it happens. Does anyone have that page actually of where the rape occurs? I had it. 176. So part 5. Is it part 5? Yeah, part 5, chapter 4. So yeah, if we do take the moment in which Robert is raped by his men as an ending, which I think there's an argument to be made there, what ends from a narrative sense? What would have been set up earlier in the narrative that ends or begins to end with that moment?
I don't know where it, but like things like they're so like high up and like orderly, like you should obey everything they do, and then after the rape, and it's like okay, like where like where those things goes. I don't know how to explain it though.
Okay, so Robert's second, for those of you who can't see because it's down in the corner here, I wrote his sense of authority kind of shatters, right? Technically, those men are under his command at that point in the novel. So his perception of their, right, of his authority over them shatters because obviously he was the victim of a crime, a horrific crime. So there's that sense of power in that literal sense that's shifted, and that ends. We can also take a more symbolic or metaphoric approach to it, right? Just kind of any sense of innocence that Robert had is also shattered in that moment. So yes, he had performed an act of murder with the German at that point, but the sexual innocence that had been set up prior, right, both with the prostitute in the brothel and with Barbara, right, at the hospital, had been completely shattered, right? So any kind of idea of consensual and intimate relations was just broken from that moment. So absolutely. And so
It's also really important that he was like Tapler being penetrated.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I know in Greek culture they believed that as long as you were penetrated, you were a man. You weren't gay. You weren't. But to be penetrated was the worst.
Yeah.
Like to be a woman, which is why they hate women so much.
So, if we remember, yesterday we talked about how Tapler in that same brothel is described as having a homosexual relationship, right? Presumably consensual, right? It's never really said, but we can assume. And Tapler, for a big good chunk of the novel, is Robert's hero, right? He looks up to him as a brave person, as a leader, as an authority figure. Okay? And you're right, there's a kind of inversion of this that's happening. He goes through a similar process of Tapler, of being penetrated, you're right, but it's in a completely non-consensual setting, right? And so any kind of authority that or heroic quality that would have been associated with Tapler is also removed. His hopes of being like Tapler in the symbolic sense are dashed. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Good. All right. Any other points for all of these are related to Robert, of course. And I understand why. He's obviously the main character, but is there anything else where he's concerned that we might emphasize? Why don't we consider his death his ending? Because it seems like the obvious choice. And sometimes the obvious choice is correct as well. But why is that not the first thing that would have come to your mind?
His death is almost an afterthought.
Okay. What makes you say that? I'm going to start erasing some of the things on the board. Are we all good for that? Oh, yeah, good. Take a picture and then yeah, so why is his death an afterthought? In what sense?
Because he gets knocked down and knocked down and knocked down until he's finally at the bottom. And then the nurse offers to kill him, and he says not yet, which I can't say that I fully understood, but it's almost like he was resigned to his death, but there were just like a few loose ends that he wanted to tie up first.
Yeah. Okay, so his death is an afterthought. I like that. Okay. And so you said he was basically as close to death as he could be in that moment, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Like inside, internally. Like the norm,
Do you want to find, or can anyone, if they have it, great. If not, I'll look for it. The moment where you're talking, Mel, of him being of the nurse offering to inject him. While I talk for a bit. So, I guess you can say he's kind of husk. At that point in the narrative, after the barn burning and so on, right, he's severely burned, right, to the point of being unrecognizable. He goes back to the hospital. Barbara, with whom he had been having a sexual relation at this point, completely rejects him. Right? Barbara's not that good of a person, I think, at the end of the day. But we can talk about her just in a discussion of other characters in the novel. So she does not really acknowledge his presence after he no longer becomes handsome and heroic. He can barely walk. Right? And even his family thinks he's dead, right, for a bit, because he goes missing in action, and everyone thinks that he's a coward. Right? So even if Barbara rejects him, right? Which makes sense for her character, I guess. But for his family also rejects him socially, right? Because he doesn't fit in with the standards that his mother had established at the beginning of the novel, right? Be a man. Although his mother is pretty sad, of course. Obviously, she's devastated that he actually does die, and we can talk about that in a minute. Did you have the passage?
Yeah.
What page is it?
It's 196.
Okay, I was 1 page away. All right. So for those of you who are looking for it, it's just before chapter 15. So just before part 5, chapter 15, page 196 towards the bottom. This is Juliet talking. No, sorry, Marion. It's a transcript of Marion Turner, another nurse. Here we go. I'm a nurse. I wanted to help him die. Here she turned from the window, but her face could still not be seen, only the blaze of the late dying light behind her. I'm a nurse. I've never offered death to anyone. I've prayed for it often enough, but I've never made the offer. But that night, surrounded by all that dark and all those men in pain, and the trains kept bringing us more and more and more, and the war was never, never, never going to end. That night, I thought, I am ashamed to be alive. I am ashamed of life. And I wanted to offer the some way out of life. I wanted grace for Robert Ross. And by then, I knew the young MP who sat by the bed, and I sent him away, some errand, water, the bedpan. I don't remember what it was. And when he was gone, I sat in his place, in the chair by Ross's bed, and I looked down through the lamplight and the bars. There were bars on the bed to keep him from falling out in his sleep. In his sleep, he would dream and try to rise, and I said, I will help you if you want me to. I might as well finish it. And I knew he understood because he said, not yet, not yet. Do you see? He might have said no. He might have said never. He might have said yes. But he said, not yet. There, in those 2 words, in a nutshell, you have the essence of Robert Ross, and perhaps the essence of what it is to be alive. Not yet. Why does she say it's the essence of being alive, if we associate it so closely with Robert's death? What's the logic there?
He still had something to live for.
What did he still have to live for?
Juliet, I would say.
Okay, Juliet. Why? What justifies that? She's a 12-year-old girl at this point.
But they had a connection.
Mm-hmm.
She loved him. He loved her enough to give her those sketchbooks, which is a big deal. And he carried her candle with him. That seems to be the only thing that he did after that. He just went and stayed with her until he died. Yeah,
so even if we don't necessarily consider it a romantic connection in the traditional sense of that term, right, some kind of emotional bond seems to be had with Juliet that you could argue is what kept him going.
Maybe he thinks of her like his sister, kind of.
I think there's certainly a reading to be had there where there's Juliet that becomes a kind of stand-in for his sister, right? Someone to protect in that context. Is there anything else that might have kept Robert going in the not yet? To me, when I read not yet, I always see it as a statement of hope, right? Or a future possibility. Right? It's not yet, just to take a really basic example that doesn't really demonstrate what I'm talking about, but it's not yet supper time. Right? I'm not saying that it is now, but the future possibility of it does exist. right? What? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add on to like Juliet and her his connection to her. Like, it's also like he sees her as like a form of innocence that he might have lost, but not only just like remembrance of his sister or reminder of his sister. So he like wants to hold on to that.
Yeah, I like that. Whether we like it or not, right? They are, again, more contemporary senses, but yeah, just this image of a young girl as some form of innocence. Right? Good. Something to hold on to. Sorry, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No.
Okay. Good. Was there anything else I wanted to add about that section? Yeah, not yet. The hope. Okay. No, I think that's all I wanted to say there. Okay, good. And then the page later, right, we get he died in 1922. He was not quite 26 years old. This is right before the epilogue, by the way. It's the final pages of the narrative. He is not quite 26 years old. There is a photograph of Robert and Juliet taken about a year before his death. He wears a close-fitting cap, like a toque, pulled down over his ears. He has no eyebrows, his nose is disfigured and bent, and his face is a mass of scar tissue. Juliet is looking up at him, speaking, and Robert is looking directly at the camera. He is holding Juliet's hand, and he is smiling. Mr. Ross was the only member of his family who came to see him buried. On the gravestone, Juliet had inscribed the following words: earth and air and fire and water. Robert Ross, 1896 to 1922. So we get the unequivocal death. And then, ironically, we immediately go back to his life, right, to a past moment in his life just before the war. And I think that reinforces kind of what we're talking about in the lost innocence and the hope, right? In his death, and not the same context, of course, but in a similar move to what we saw in Angélique going back home, right, at the end when she dies. What happens to Robert as soon as he dies is there's a narrative flashback to that moment of still having hope that he could be a hero. Again, tying explicitly these two elements together. And the only person, of course, who's there at his funeral is the person who arguably had the most confidence in him, aside from his sister. So that's, I think, proof of all of this. Before we get to the gravestone, anything else we wanted to add about this?
His brother Stuart is a monster.
Yeah.
There's no reason to not be there at his gravestone. His mom, I get it, like she got overwhelmed in line.
Yes.
But Stuart is just like an
Stuart's
unfeeling.
Yeah. What? The mythology part. Sorry, I just saw a line that I wanted to bring up later. Why do you say Stuart is a monster?
Because, well, you get a hint of it at the beginning. When he says Stuart could take care of the rabbits, and the mom was like, obviously not. Do you know Stuart? Have you met him?
Yeah.
And then later on, when he finds out that, I can't remember where exactly it was, when he goes missing in action, and Stuart's like, I'm going to tell my classmates tomorrow. Maybe he'll get a medal. This is a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. I had noted that down. I think it's part 5-9. Yeah. Not that Stuart wished Robert ill, but the thought of going to school and saying, Robert is dead, he'll probably get the Victoria Cross. This was marvelous to contemplate, and it sent a shiver down his back. Right? So he's only thinking of his brother in relation to the glory that might be associated to the family. Right? Yeah, I guess this is as good of a time as any to talk about the secondary characters. Does anyone want to take a picture of this before we're good? We're good, yeah. So Stuart sucks, as we've just established. Okay. But I think there's a helpful exercise in talking about the secondary characters because they obviously serve a purpose. What purpose do secondary characters serve generally?
Foils.
Okay, so they can be foils. Do we all know what Mel means when she used the term foil? Basically, an antagonist or someone who stops, right, the main character from achieving what they truly want. Right? Arguably, there's a few foils for Robert throughout his narrative. Yeah.
I actually think secondary, when you don't always see the main character is not just himself.
Yeah, they do serve a storytelling function insofar as they flesh out the world, right? They give you a brief respite from always focusing on the protagonist. You're absolutely right. And it tells you a little bit more about the world that they're living in through other people's lenses. Right? So that's more of a minutia, right, of storytelling, but it's just as important. Good. So secondary characters can, of course, also add on to what the main character is trying to do, okay? In complementing what they do or helping them in that whatever quest they're doing. So, what would we say then, considering what we just said? I'm starting with Stuart here because we just mentioned him, but what would we say is Stuart's purpose in the narrative, if we want to ascribe a purpose to him aside from just being a garbage human being? Does he serve some kind of narrative purpose that moves the story or characters forward in some way?
I feel instinctively that Stuart would have been easily one of the gang members. He's the type of person who would be one of those guys.
Okay, good. I guess to put it in narrative terms, he presents a good mirror, I guess, to Robert, his brother. Okay? Where Robert tries to do the good thing, you're right, I can easily imagine Stuart as taking a completely opposite route, not necessarily having any qualms in operating in the field of war. Right?
Because Robert has so much empathy and Stuart seems to have no empathy.
Yeah, good. Apathetic. Damn it. I'll just put apathy here. Right. Good. So on a narrative level, Stuart allows us to see Robert's qualities a little bit more clearly, right? By presenting such a clear parallel, right? Or such a clear mirror. Same family, completely different outcome. We see this all the time, just in real life, right? Two brothers that are completely dissimilar, right? Not necessarily that one's good or bad, right? But just entirely different people. And so it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that this type of thing happens. Okay. We've already talked quite a bit about Taffler, so we're not necessarily going to do that, but I will write him down. Right? So you can put him down as a hero or role model. Good.
There's Harris, who never actually sees battle.
Yeah. So Harris, you're right, never actually sees battle. So why would we put that in there? In famously a story about war.
Because Robert and Harris are good friends. They love each other, and then Harris manages to die before he experiences all the trauma that Robert experiences. So then Robert thinks of Harris as being himself if he was innocent, and that's represented by the blue scarf being repeated throughout the book. Specifically tearing in the third section right before he kills the Germans.
Often, even if it's not explicitly said by the storyteller, okay, you do often get these moments. In the case of Stewart, it's a negative version, but in the case of Harris, it's a positive version of what could have been in stories. Right? This character exists, right? Not because of a familial relation to the main character, but just is a general stand-in for other possibilities that do exist in this life. Which, in many ways, again, offers some kind of hope, right? Of otherwise. Because if there was no hope of otherwise, we wouldn't be interested in the story at all, right? If we know from the start that there is no chance that Robert gets out alive, right? Page 1, he just gets shot. Not great, right? And every single person in the story also dies a gruesome death. There's nothing to actually hope for, right? Or reach out to. So you have to have, you don't have to, but you should have some kind of character there who represents otherwise. Right? Gives you that narrative sense of hope. Good. Excellent. Someone other than Mel, you're doing great. What other characters could we highlight? Some of them we've mentioned before, but...
Rowena.
I'm sorry?
Rowena.
Rowena, good, yeah.
She was very short, so.
Yeah, so she dies 20 pages in, but...
But I feel like she had an impact on Ross. Like a big.
Yeah. Definitely shapes Robert, right, as a person. Arguably, his empathy develops because of Rowena, or at least his relationship to her. Okay. Excellent. And as we talked about a little bit yesterday, her death really kickstarts his emotional arc. Yeah, in many ways it does. Yeah, definitely. There is an alternate story wherein if she doesn't die, he doesn't necessarily have anyone that he needs to prove himself to.
Yeah, it kind of brings up what I was thinking. I don't think in terms of people necessarily, but I think of like the war itself being like a character that kind of is like almost like a foil, like you're saying, that kind of prevented him from being who he was, or he was who he was going to be. And like not, and maybe even like a narrower focus, like authority in general. That just kind of like make him. It forces him everything to happen the way it did. The war itself, and then like authority to achieve in the end rebels against it. Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to that rebellion against authority when I read. No, but it's a good foreshadowing. No, it's awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
Like if she didn't die, it would be a different like point of view for the story, because he wouldn't have had that person that he needed to prove and show. Proud.
There are two answers to this. One takes the question seriously and says, yes, I do think he would. Right? There are some literary critics who would say that's an irrelevant question because that's not how the story actually did play out. Right? So it's as arbitrary a question as saying, what if the Nazis won World War II? Like, you can imagine, and it's fun, but it's a different story. Right, inevitably, right? For all that entails. Creative alternative for the essay, right? what does that what do those first few chapters look like if she didn't die, right? Maybe Robert just stays on the estate and has a happy life and drinks tea until he dies. I don't know. That would be a boring story, but it would be a story.
5-minute chicken dinner with his family.
Yeah, exactly. And what was it? The tomatoes, scalloped tomatoes. Okay. I do want to bring up just quickly his mother, and probably the most, or one of the most important secondary characters, even if she doesn't get a lot of action, so to speak. Why is she so important? And I think that ties into what, Mark, after you were mentioning about authority, I think she's definitely a figure of authority. I guess, spoiler. So authority is one of them.
And then she highlights emotional, how mothers would react to grief and losing our children.
I'm going to put here maternal instinct in some way. Obviously, this is different from one person to another, but again, symbolically or thematically, you can definitely see that being the case, which is what makes that scene in the beginning so strange, right? When she says, kill the bunnies, right? Or she encourages him to kill the rabbits, because it seems to completely clash against what you would expect a maternal instinct to be, which is to save a living creature, right? And especially encouraging your own progeny to do so, right? So yes, she has that maternal instinct, but that maternal instinct is also its own figure of authority, right? And it's this kind of vicious cycle that plays out.
I almost felt like she was play acting. Not play acting in maternal, well, maybe even play acting in maternal instinct, but she has this big idea that she wants to project this image of herself, and she tries to follow the scripts to project this image of herself, but then she completely snaps and can't cope. The things that she's supposed to do, like going to see him at the train to say goodbye, she can't do it because she just doesn't have the capacity to actually follow through to do it, the real thing when it matters. Instead, she just play acts at being the responsible citizen, mother person.
Which, again, is a thing that you see all kinds of people doing. That's arguably what makes her one of the most human characters in the novel, right? Is because you can imagine still that type of person existing today, right? Or at least I can. I've certainly met people like this in my life. Right? This is what a mother or a father or whatever is supposed to be like, and so I will act like that. And then when no one else is looking, then I'll be, a little bit better, or drop the facade, so to speak. I know we said we would focus on the second half, and we will, but that scene at the beginning where she walks into Robert having a bath, for example, which is a bit weird, right, for us now. But it does kind of demonstrate this weird trifecta that we're talking about, right? In one way, it's pure maternal instinct, right? Even as an adult, go in as your child is hurt and try to clean them or at least comfort them, right? But there's also a little bit of playing where there is that kind of cold distance between the two throughout that entire scene. Neither of them quite know how to act in that scenario because it's odd to have a young adult be watched over by your mother in the bath, right? And of course, that playing reinforces her as a figure of authority. Seeing him and watching over him at his literally most vulnerable, injured, naked, in a cold bath or whatever. It's never happened to me in my life. If that ever happened, I would never get over it, right? Just emotionally crushing, devastating, right? I would never respect myself again. No, that's not true. But right, like it is. You can't imagine like that kind of authoritative, weight in that moment. Certainly, even though ostensibly it is a maternal act of care. She's a fascinating character. And just to come back to that ending.
It's like she tries to do the right thing, but it's the wrong way.
Yeah.
Sounds like lots of mothers.
Yeah. So in that sense, right, the element that the von Clausewitz quote at the beginning doesn't just apply to matters of war, right, in the most literal sense, but it also applies to the secondary characters as well, right? What is more benevolent than a mother? At least symbolically speaking, right? Usually we try to associate them with benevolence. And a lot of her errors emotionally crush Robert. And of course, the only time that she actually does act in a way that you would expect is by the time that it's too late, right? Where she goes blind. Where is it? Chapter, I want to say it's 9.
Looking for Clifford Purchase.
I'm looking for where she says she goes blind.
That's before. When he goes missing in action.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Yeah. 180 says so. Yeah, chapter 9. Almost towards the end, right? So at this point, Robert had gone missing in action. He hadn't died yet. But for all intents and purposes, he was dead to his family, right? As a coward, or as someone who is perceived as a coward. And then there's that bit between Mr. and Mrs. Ross. Help, she said. Nobody moved. Help, said Mrs. Ross. Mr. Ross in the drawing room stood up. He advanced toward the hallway. Help me, said Mrs. Ross. Mr. Ross put out his hand. Where, said Mrs. Ross. Where are you? Mr. Ross said, I'm here. Mrs. Ross said, I'm sorry, please, I cannot see you. Mr. Ross went across the parquet floor and sat beside his wife. He put his arm around her shoulder and held her against his side. She was cold. I'm blind, said Mrs. Ross. I've gone blind. There was not a trace of emotion left in her voice, but she fumbled with her fingers and found her husband's hand. Never mind, said Mr. Ross. Never mind. Here we are. So, that face is exactly what the face you're supposed to have. Despite the coldness of her voice, right, the lack of emotion that's projected, right, there's a sense that in that moment, it's not because she doesn't feel anything for the loss of her son, but I think it's representative of also what's indicating the fact that she's cold. Right? She lost a part of herself in losing Robert. She just can't express it in that sense. She dies as well, like a cold body. Even if she did express it at that point in the narrative, what purpose would it have served except to absolve herself in the eyes of her husband, maybe, right? Robert will never hear that. So again, there's a whole essay that you could write on Mrs. Ross, by the way, in case you're looking for ideas. Okay. So just because we brought it up, change the settings. We've addressed it somewhat, obviously, throughout the narrative or throughout our class. Oh, it's just weirdly truncated, no matter which ratio I put it at. There we go. Okay. There we go. So we've already pretty much discussed this first question of how does Ross relate to figures of authority, first at home and then in the war. I think we've pretty much got that. By the way, these questions can also be good ones for essay topics. If you want to go off of these, feel free. I'm happy to put this PowerPoint up on Moodle if you want inspiration. Most of this PowerPoint is just questions, right, that I was thinking of. So feel free to take any of these. So we've already discussed this. First, of course, it's in relation to his mother and his father, and then with the command of the military. I didn't put it as a question, but Mark, you brought it up, so I might as well ask it. Right? Mark said earlier that he rebels against figures of authority. Right? That's arguably one of the endings, right, that you could claim for Robert on a thematic level, is that he does eventually rebel. In what ways?
Well, there's lots of ways, but I also think that he rebelled sooner than that. I think that he was rebelling when they were against the rabbits. Right then, that was the first. He took a stand and was like trying to fight for something.
That's true. He took a stand. Did he succeed? No. That doesn't mean that it's not a rebellion, right? There are plenty of failed rebellions. But you can certainly see a rebellious streak, even if he doesn't necessarily have the strength to pull it.
Like the capability of trying to resist authority, if he felt his moral didn't align with it.
Yes, right. So the morality element is probably the greatest driving force of his rebellious nature, right, throughout the novel. Even if it's not rebellion in the way that we would think about it now, right, in like armed rebellion. How can you do armed rebellion in the context of the war? You, I guess, become a pacifist, right, in that sense. Does being a pacifist succeed for Robert? Arguably no, because he kills the German, right? And then what other ways does he actually rebel against a figure of authority? There's like one major moment.
Oh, he shoots Leather.
Yeah. So he shoots a commanding officer. Right?
Between the eyes.
Right between the eyes. Right? Guy told him to he was the one who told him not to go
Horses.
Yeah, not to save the horses. Robert shoots him. Again, arguably one of the culminating moments of the narrative that kicks off one of the endings, right? It's because at that point, right, even if he had saved the horses and everyone was still alive, right, or all the other soldiers were still alive, like there's a world in which you could still get away with that, right? Like, yeah, you disobeyed an order, but you still stayed among your people, right? You were not a coward, a deserter, right? Shooting a commanding officer and running off with one of those horses dooms him, right? And again, are probably morally correct in doing so. I'm not the arbiter of that, right? But you don't feel angry towards Robert for having done it, necessarily.
It was almost like the same thing with the German soldier, where it was all like instinctive.
Yeah.
And that he just instinctively did it, and thus he was on that path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that scene is so interesting because you get a sense that there was almost going to be an understanding between the two. They were both looking at each other. Were they going to shoot? Weren't they? And then, it just kind of devolves afterwards. Good.
So saying that another still from the movie that you used, that was a disturbing scene. To see, like, visually the dead bodies and the dead horses and stuff like that. And like it made me think about like more like the animal themes and what they represent and what they mean to him and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, arguably the movie does a better job with the horses than the book does, if only because the book doesn't always describe them, but in the movie they're in some way always in the shot, right? Because they're ever present. So as a symbol, you have them constantly looming over the characters or in relation to the characters. So there are some ways in which the movie does become really effective. Absolutely. Okay. No. Well, do we have any other? The only thing I wanted to say about eyes and vision, I'll mention it now because it makes sense to talk about it here right before the break, and then we'll take a break and finish off like our final thoughts about the novel. So we brought it up in relation to Robert's mother, right, who goes blind at the end, but arguably she voluntarily goes blind before that, right, where she decides to put sunglasses on and not look at other people around her in the streets, right, as she becomes traumatized in her own way, right, by the physical inexistence of her son or absence of her son. She doesn't want to look people in the eyes or be reminded that other people exist. But this scene from the movie also demonstrates how vision and perception shines through. In case you wanted a visual component of what's described, right? People are constantly losing sight throughout the story, right? Because of gas, mud. Right? There's this fantastic. I should have written it down. It's in the first half, but there's this fantastic moment where it's like it was just mud, and I can't even describe how thick and awful this mud was. It was just everywhere, right? And you get this sense of ever-present natural weight, right, that covers up everyone. Or there's this moment where this is at a different stage, but where Robert is leading his men and then they get turned around, right? And they have no idea where they are. And they weren't even trying to get lost, right? They were just moving, right? And they completely lose any sense of space and time.
It was so foggy.
It was so foggy, yeah. Yeah. And arguably going in the straight line is the easiest thing to do. You just keep going, right? And they ended up completely wrapped up around each other. So I guess my question would be, why is that such an important motif in the book and arguably the movie? Why would Findley put so much emphasis on people's ability or inability to perceive themselves or others or the world around them? Right. I think even if you haven't finished the novel, you can kind of begin to answer that. I think there's an instinctive way in which that plays into storytelling.
Imagine being exposed to that much violence and death makes you lose your perception of reality.
Yeah, okay, good. So the violence, I guess you could say desensitized in a way. In the most basic sense, right, when we talk about desensitized, we were talking about horror movies the other day, right? Late last week, where when I watch a horror movie now, it's not because I'm a bad person, or at least I don't think I'm a psycho, but like when I see a horror movie, it doesn't register in the same way as it did when I first started watching horror movies and I was like viscerally, impacted by what I was seeing on the screen, right? At some point, your brain just kind of registers the violence to a point that you no longer see it in the same way, right? That's what we mean when we say that we're desensitized to certain things. Or we were talking, and we'll come back to this, but we were talking about photographs a little bit earlier and how our ability to perceive real life violence has completely changed over the last few decades, where it would be completely inconceivable, say 50 years ago when television first, 60, 70 years ago almost, when television first started to appear in American or North American homes, to put footage of bombed out countries on television. You could never do that, right? You would have been censored like this, right? The entire broadcast would have been cut off in seconds. Right? Now it's the most normal thing. You can turn on the 6 o'clock news and no one would bat an eye if they see a building exploding.
Like when they first aired War of the Worlds, people thought it was real. So,
Yeah, right.
You know,
Apparently that's a bit of a myth.
really?
Yeah, it's like the only people who thought of it was real were people who missed like the first 5 minutes where they said it and then they kind of caught up with it. But anyway, but it's still a good example, right, of what we expect as far as levels of violence are concerned. And being exposed to it in real time is certainly something that would desensitize you to actually perceiving it, right, in front of you. Good. Anything else?
I was thinking about vision, like how they see themselves, or like, for example, how the mother sees Robert, like how she envisioned him, and how that changes, and what happens.
Yeah.
And then there's like also like another literal thing would be like the actual fog of war. It's literally fog of war when they're walking around and get lost. And
Yeah, good. There's a yeah, and then I saw your hand. Right? The self-perception and expectation one is really interesting. When we say that there's something odd about saying the expression, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Obviously, you're not like seeing it with your own eyes. You can't look into the future, right? But we still associate the terms of vision and perception to that, right? How do I imagine someone, right? And this is, no, it's not exclusive to English. There's a lot of languages that do that, but English does this quite explicitly, right? Of tying imagination and vision together, right? Or self-perception and vision together on a linguistic level. Yes, Emily.
I was associating as a vision to like maybe like the setting or like the camera of the way, like how it's colored
You were talking about camera. You said camera. Yeah.
the color, they use certain colors for different places depending on how they receive it. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
you kept talking a lot about sepia.
The sepia, yeah. So sepia, by the way, when they use that, this is sepia. This is this color. It's the color of old. It's basically what it is. When you imagine the Wild West, we usually imagine it in like sepia colors, right? And so technically it's monochrome, right? A lot of these photographs, and we can come back because photographs are its own kind of vision and perception. And despite it being black and white or sepia, for example, you still see a lot of color to what is being represented, right? On the metaphorical sense of it builds out this world. I mean, you can envision it much more explicitly. Good. So I know it's 7:30. I'm nothing if not a man of my word. I will let you take a break. Take a few minutes, come back, and when we do, try to think of some passages that you might want to focus on for the second half, just so I'm not the only one talking in front of the class. Not that I mind, as you know, I like the sound of my own voice. So come back in a couple minutes. So, we talked about the end, authority, eyes, vision. We'll return to the title at the end, but before I go on and on, was there anything in particular that in your readings, any of you wanted to highlight or bring up that either emphasizes what we've talked about so far, or that is something we have not talked about at all, and that you think is important to raise in the context of this novel?
I think. I think Clifford Purchase is important to mention.
Okay.
Because he knows him from school right from the beginning, and he has these big dreams of becoming a hero, and he romanticizes war.
Yep.
And then he just stumbles upon him later at the end of the novel in the mud, dead, just like everybody else.
Yeah. So, did we all hear that? Because Clifford is a childhood friend, and to put it in Mel's words, literally, we stumble upon him dead among other bodies towards the end of the novel. Right? It's completely ungraceful as an ending. Right? He's just one among many other bodies. Right? So, to continue our list of secondary characters, right? So Clifford. In the narrative sense, what purpose would that serve? I'm trying to look up where he actually dies. I wrote it down, but so we see him a lot in like part 1. And Clifford is the one. Isn't he the one who was carrying around the book as well? The On War, or am I thinking of someone else? It was someone else. Yeah. Okay.
Levitt.
It was Levitt. Yeah. Okay.
Finds him in 7. I don't know which section I'm in right now.
Part 5, chapter 7. Yeah.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
He tried to coax the horse forward, but it was useless. Robert got down to see what the problem might be.
Just before part 8, by the way, for those of you who are looking.
He shone his torch at the mud, in which he was wading up to his shins. He saw that there was a body lying in the road. It was a man without a trench coat, an officer. He had been shot in the back and was sprawled face down. Robert rolled him over carefully, thinking he might still be alive, but he wasn't. He was quite dead, and had been for more than an hour. It was Clifford Purchase.
Yeah. Although Clifford is dead in that moment, I can't help but still see a glimmer of Robert's hope in this scene, right? Because your first instinct, at least again speaking for myself, when you see a man with a bullet wound face down in mud, your first instinct wouldn't be, oh, maybe he's still alive, right? Like at some point, I think you would asphyxiate, right? Just being face down in the mud I can't imagine it would take that long, right? So on the one hand, it says a lot about Robert, right? Still hopeful. It also says quite a bit about the element of war, right? That reason no longer prevails in those contexts because there is no technical reason why you would make sense of that. You see a person not moving right there, right? Face down, not even trying to breathe, right? So it does say quite a bit, right? At least on those two levels. But again, I guess coming back to our initial question, does Clifford serve a purpose for the narrative, or is he just there for a kind of shock for Robert in that sense? I'm looking at you because you raised it, but anyone can answer this question. By the way, sometimes characters don't serve much of a purpose aside from just being an emotional weight, right? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I said existing.
Existing, right, on the one hand. He just is, right? Clifford is.
For me, it was just a reminder that no matter what your perception of war is, you're part of the meat grinder.
Okay, right. So
like even being desensitized to it, or not apathetic, but like his brother, being that kind of person, you're still just part of the meat grinder.
Right. There's a really interesting moment. This is in part 3 when they get attacked by gas. Right? Arguably, Clifford is integral to their survival, even if he's not the one acting in that specific instance. Does anyone know why? Or just remember why? It's oh shoot, where is it? Part 3. Just yeah. So whenever they were attacked by gas, and
There in that.
Hmm?
Clifford wasn't there.
No, he was mentioned. He's not there physically, but he's mentioned. The urine part and the chemistry class.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, I'll eventually try to find it.
It's page 128,
Oh, okay, that wasn't that far.
127 it starts.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so so in the 9:30 a.m. section of part 3, so page 127, the part that starts, they waited. Yeah, and one of the elements that is brought up in that section is that because Clifford is a childhood friend, right? They went to school together and so on. Robert remembers a chemistry class that they took together and remembered that one of the things that could save them from something like gas is ammonium, right? And because none of the soldiers have gas masks, right, for resource reasons, right, Robert orders his men to basically pee on some cloth and put it over their face. Right? Sounds disgusting, is disgusting, but in the fog of war, as we mentioned earlier, you'll do anything to survive. But it creates a really interesting role in absentia for Clifford, right, in being a literal, right, grounding or basis for survival. Much in the same way as Juliet, right, we were talking about earlier, becomes a stand-in for Robert's dead sister and someone that he has hope for and wants to protect and maybe has some kind of drive for. Someone else from Robert's past, in this case Clifford, gives him some kind of basis to push forward and live. Right? Would he have remembered this obscure thing from chemistry class if he didn't also associate it in his mind with a friend? Right? Someone to live for, to live with, right? Again, I don't know. We're fabulating in this case. It's a what if of the narrative. But at least the story, as it's told to us, explicitly creates this relation between Clifford and survival. Right? That's how Robert remembers the past, is through Clifford, and therefore allows him to survive. And again, coming back to like regular life, we do this all the time. Right? We remember moments not by their details, but because it's associated with a specific smell, right? Because it's associated with a specific person that we once knew really well, but we kind of fell out of touch, and whatever it may be, kind of food. And so it does kind of tie in quite explicitly to one of the main themes of the novel that we didn't talk about in painful detail, but that is certainly present. Memory. Right? Robert remembers Clifford, right, in an obvious sense, but there's also all kinds of other ways in which memory is expressed. Right? The transcripts are arguably a form of memory, right? Oral stories being passed down and recorded. Even the archivist, when the transcript breaks down, remembers what was happening and so tries to put it there, right, on the page. So there's literal memory. We have the photos that we keep coming back to that become stand-in for memory. Clifford is just one more example of this in this very specific moment. Arguably, the entire thing is a memory because it's told after the fact. We don't know it yet, but Robert is dead by the time the story begins, and we're just going back and filling in the blanks. Right? The entire thing's a memory. It's just different people's memories being collaged together. I'm sure that's not where you intended to go with Clifford when we first started, but that's where my mind went. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up with Clifford?
I suppose you could say if he associates Clifford in his mind with survival,
Yeah.
then seeing him dead in the road is just another step in his descent, another thing to give up on.
Yeah. It's both a foreshadowing of his own death, right, and a nail in his own emotional coffin. Good. Okay. That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Marvelous.
What else? You're really going to make me speak for the next hour?
I was being louder.
I'm sorry?
I was being louder. Isn't it marvelous?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so let's come back to that, I guess. Why do we think the gravestone has earth and air and fire and water inscribed on it? Because throughout the novel, Robert is most explicitly associated with animals: horse, rabbit, coyote. Right? Where does the earth and air and fire and water come in? Why is that what Juliet decides to put on his tombstone? Nothing.
I could not figure that one out.
Okay. I mean, it is a bit more tenuous, but it is somewhat foreshadowed with things like the mud, right? Which is what? Water and earth kind of mixed together, right? In a disgusting mass.
Gas for the air. And
gas for the air.
That's pretty grim for a tombstone.
It is very grim for a tombstone. Yeah. So why because the mud also is a grim scene, right? Where they are constantly wading through it and trying to get just a few feet ahead of them, right? It's dire, to use the terms of the novel. There was another passage. This was, the part 2. The gas. There's,
He almost drowns in the dike.
He almost drowns. Some of the men do also almost drown. Right? To me, the way I read it, right, why this kind of earth and air and fire and water was brought up, these 4 elements at the very end, there's kind of 2 ways that you can read it. One, it's Juliet emphasizing what's been implied, right, with Robert's association with animals, is that he's a little bit more closer to nature in that sense, right? And that's just made explicit by the end. Or he's someone who has survived the worst distortions of those particular elements, right? In the mud, in the gas, in the crossing of the oceans in order to get to Europe and almost drowning and so on. And once in death, all of those things have kind of stopped being their worst versions of themselves, and he goes back into the earth, right? Back into the world. But it's true, it's probably one of the more obscure parts of the novel. It ends on a real mystery. And I think the novel does want you to think that. Because only a few pages before, so this is 7 pages before on my copy, at the very beginning of part 5, chapter 12. The very first sentence. Here is where the mythology is muddled. So even the narrative acknowledges that we know certain things up to a point. And after that, it just kind of becomes questions. The ending itself is uncertain. If it's not it's almost the last chapter. Chapter 12, we're 2 chapters away from the actual end. Right? So it almost mirrors that kind of uncertainty of what happens after death. Right? As Robert gets closer and closer to his actual demise, we know less and less about him and the events of his life. And we're really emphasizing the piecing together. And all that's left to put on the gravestone, and again, you can disagree with my reading of this, is him going back into the earth. Is there a God that he goes to? Who's to say? Right? All we know is that he will dissolve. Right?
This could be something pretty that she wanted to put on it.
Yeah.
It could be super deep either, I guess.
Yeah, no. There is no one who is more to blame for the over-analysis of novels than English teachers, right? Like, I might be completely misreading this. Right? I would be the first to acknowledge that. Maybe it's just something pretty. It could absolutely be. The only reason that makes me think it's not the case is because it's the ending, right? Like, it would be an odd place to just leave it at, Although at the same time, right, as I'm saying it out loud, and then I saw your hand move, as I'm saying it out loud, it might also just be a relief after all the unrelenting destruction that happens in the novel, so maybe it does fit in with just pretty nature. Yeah, go ahead.
There's like a lot of things that sense of like the mystery of war. One was the song that those things that like we're here because we're here because we're here. It's like
why are we here? Yeah.
And it's kind of like circular.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like
Yeah. And at the end of the day, right, why are we here is also a death-related question. Right? Like, that is literally the instigator of so much philosophy and so much religion. Right? Why are we here? Because Allah wanted it, right? Because Jehovah wanted it. Because
what are they saying? Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, like 42 or something?
Yeah, exactly. Because 42. Yeah, exactly. I was not expecting the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to be referenced in this class, but why
You should
not?
always be expecting the Hitchhiker's Guide.
Yeah. Is it still a popular novel? It's such a good one.
Yeah.
Ish. Yeah. Or people understand like the 42 reference? No, not really. Yeah, okay. My favorite part of that novel is still the beginning. It's like, he had finally found the truth to the universe, and no one would have to be nailed to a tree in order to, like, justify it. It's so fantastic. And then the person dies. Anyway. I've been thinking of teaching that novel just like a middle of the semester type of novel to just ease us into the rest of it would completely not fit in the context of this class, but
I think it's interesting that it
go ahead.
doesn't tell where he's buried. It says that his dad is the only one who comes. He says that Juliet chose his gravestone, but it doesn't say where he's buried.
I think that adds on to the reading of him just being a part of the earth around him. It could literally be anywhere. It doesn't really matter. Why are we here? Right? Also adds on to this.
friendship.
Sorry, do you want to start that again? Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say him and Harrison's friendship is mentioned turns to ash.
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah.
idea.
The fire part.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
As going back to
Yes, exactly. But of course, it's never nothing, right? That's the point. Even if your physical human body is not there, right? The atoms that once formed your physical human body are somewhere. Right? If there's one thing that modern science has taught us, is that nothing ever ceases to exist. Right? And in a way, they bring that up. Never that which shit is shall die. Right? It's the ultimate circularity of the novel. Right? It tells you right at the beginning how it's going to end. And yet it still feels satisfying. I guess that's as good of a place to segue into that. Did it end in the way that we expected it to? Right, like yesterday we spent some time on the epigraphs, thinking, oh, does it tell us quite a bit about how it's going to end? And I guess on some kind of thematic level it does, or it tells us what to expect for the novel. But did we see the ending coming? Or the endings, if we want to come back to the class.
Something that I think about with World War One specifically is if I hear a story of somebody going off to fight in World War One, I don't expect them to come back.
Right. So, in a similar way to Angélique, right, we kind of know that it's going to end in a tragic manner. I would be very surprised if anyone here thought that Robert was going to make it to the end of the novel. Well, he does actually make it to the end of the novel, but right, he dies. Right, he doesn't survive to tell his own story. Right? I would have been very surprised if anyone was like, "Of course he's going to live." Right? We're trained at this point not to think that. Did we think it was going to happen in that particular way? I was personally surprised the first time I read it. Right?
I was surprised. I just thought he would. I thought that he would die in a heroic way.
Me too. I thought he would die in the fire of the horses.
Yeah. I think that's the biggest surprise. Certainly. I think we until the horses bit, and that adds on to the Margaret bit, and that adds on to it being an ending in and of itself. You still think there's an opportunity for a heroic death. I would agree with that. Yeah.
But even like at that point, I knew it wasn't going to be heroic because how he shot this leather.
Yeah, leather.
So I mean, like leading up to that, I just thought it'd be some kind of heroic, save somebody's life, or for a group of people or something.
I guess it's worth asking the question: is it somewhat heroic? Because he does try. He fails, but he does try to save some lives at the end.
I also think that Robert does follow our expectations of a hero in the Hector model.
Okay.
Because, like, when he goes to the crater and he realizes that no one else has a gas mask, you never think that he's just going to put on his gas mask, because that wouldn't be his character. It wouldn't fulfill your expectations based on what you understand of who he is.
Yeah. And yet he fights off the people who want to get at his gas mask, right?
Yeah, and then he gives it to the injured guy.
Yeah, that's true. Right, that's true. He does give it to me.
Because chaos is not the answer either. He's trying to make a plan.
Definitely. Right. I'm just looking, through my the photographs. So I guess now's a good time. So I talked about this a little bit yesterday. Why do you think Findley pluralized the title?
I think because there's a literal war and there's an internal war.
So there's the internal and actual, right? What's the internal war?
the war within itself.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, so There's actual World War One. Okay. There's the internal war that we talked about in a bunch of ways. Right? His own personal battles. Will I do this? Will I not? Etc. and so forth. Anything else?
I think they're all fighting an internal war. Every single person who participated in World War One was fighting for humanity.
Okay.
To a greater or lesser extent.
Right. I think that's absolutely fair.
And you just,
Arguably, even Mrs. Ross was fighting her own internal war, right? As we were talking about, even if she wasn't in the field of battle. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to cut you
kind
off.
of like he was fighting his own like military at the end there with
Right. So even the use of the term internal, even though we usually imagine it with like emotional conflict, you're right. His own men went up against him. And he went up against the figure of authority, right, with letter. So literal and emotional. Good. Emotional. Anything else? If I'm asking you a question, the answer is yes. In this case, yeah.
There's the fact, I mean, it was written in the 70s, so many other wars have happened since and will happen
Okay.
after.
So by the time Findley is writing the novel, there were 3 other wars afterwards. Right? World War II, Korean War, and every other proxy war that was happening in the Cold War, right? So Vietnam, etc. At least 3 other major wars, if not more. Right? Civil wars, right? Because you have the wars of decolonization that are happening after World War II. So all across Africa, all across Asia, all across Latin America, you have these outbursts of violence that are happening. So the war to end all wars, as it was called, ends up being the war that kicks off all wars more than anything else. Or you can take I don't know if it's less cynical or more cynical to say this. You can take a stance that the First World War is just part of the long lineage of wars. Right? We mentioned him a few times already, but von Clausewitz, for example, was a Prussian general. Right? And so he is part of that lineage of war, even though he was writing 100 years before, right, that actual First World War. And even though it's called a world war, there were other pan-European wars before that, right, that were on arguably a similar scale. So it is both a legacy of wars and a lineage, I guess. What's certain is that at least the First World War kicks off modern warfare as we understand it. Right? But as far as actual conflict is concerned, it's just another one. Right? It's just now it's bigger, longer, and uncut, to use a South Park reference. Because that's what you need for a World War I class. Is inappropriate jokes. I would say there's still more wars that are happening. And the fact that Findley is writing this in the 70s is, I think, part of this. It's a bit more of a metaphorical war, I would say. We hinted at it yesterday. And I think people's reaction to the novel at the time is rather indicative of how, in a way, what Findley is operating in is a war for history, in a sense. Findley was the first major writer to write about this historical moment, at least in Canada, who had not actually participated in that war. Right? And by then, his name was pretty well established, but this would really solidify his reputation as a writer in Canada. Right? He had written The Last of the Crazy People before that, which was pretty well received. But this would just skyrocket him to the public consciousness. And I think in part is because of his engagement with what we would imagine as history in a public sense. Right? We talked about that last week. I keep saying last week, last class. Right? So I'm not teaching you anything new in this particular instance, but it's, I don't think, a stretch to say that in causing such a debate about how we frame these moments and the fact that people were so vehemently against, for example, the depiction of homosexuality and violence in the novel, goes a long way to demonstrate that in a way this is part of a debate or a war in a metaphorical sense about what it means to write history and represent and imagine history. He was certainly not the first to do it overall, right? But he's certainly one of the more powerful representations of this. And I think he gets at that in the little interview clip that I showed you at the beginning. He's certainly aware of this discussion about what it means to engage in history. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
So you're saying?
No, go ahead.
You kind of touched on it, but like, is it also like it's sexuality, like?
I think it's part of it. Yeah.
Because like the things that happen, and also like I don't know, like talking about Robert as being effeminate and stuff like that. Like he could have very well been a homosexual.
He could have.
You know what I mean? Like if you really want to stretch that, I guess. But so yeah, like that war on acceptance or just kind of portraying someone who could be homosexual as a main character.
Yeah. Or at least, because he has relations with women afterwards in the novel. So, but he certainly engages, that the novel certainly engages with sexuality in such a frank way, right? Both heterosexual and homosexual, was certainly one of those grounds for debate at the time, right? The explicitness of the violence was also something that was raised at the time by critics and the general reading public alike. It was not an uncontroversial winner of the Governor General's Award, and for a variety of reasons. And Abube, sorry, go ahead.
Like war against censorship?
The war against censorship, but also, again, whether people were actively looking to censor it or not, it was also a question of...
Like culture wars?
Not actually pretty similar to what we would call culture wars today. I don't know if it's in as bad faith as a lot of the culture war debates, but in the sense that people were genuinely questioning what we do with these events.
Right? I do like the idea of the censorship, especially when it was the 70s and they wrote this, because they were trying to censor what was being shown in Vietnam. It was leaking through, so they couldn't censor it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, history, I guess we can add censorship. Censorship only in the sense of what makes it into the history narrative. Right? So it's a subcategory, I guess, of the history point. And again, I'm not saying that he's alone in this. Abube, you reminded me of it before class. The children's writer that we mentioned briefly last time, right? Henty?
Yeah,
Yeah, G.A. Henty. Famously never fought in some of the wars that he was depicting on the page. This was 100 years prior to Findley writing this own narrative. But no one really questioned Henty, right? Because he was writing boys' stories, right? They were meant to be fun and not taken too seriously. And I think part of the wars that Findley is dealing with is saying, no, you do actually need to take these narratives seriously, positively and negatively. It can be very harmful to play with history. The most obvious example is the Nazis, right? I'll just use them because they're typical war example, right, of rewriting certain historical elements. But you can find plenty of examples of this. And that's, I think, why also, that's one of the reasons why we're not going to go through all of these questions here, but why photographs play such an important part, to come back to that real quick in the narrative, is it removes a little bit of that veneer. And the two images that I put up here are actually quite representative of that. Both of these were produced around World War I. This one's a painting of a World War I scene. This one's obviously a photograph. Quality's awful, as you would expect from a photo, from a camera of 1914 or whatever, but just take a second and compare these two. What's the effect? Or what's the difference in effect, I should say? Same time period, same event, technically. Almost same composition.
The top one is more exaggerated.
What's exaggerated about it?
Like the top one in the middle, you can see like the little explosions and stuff,
Yeah.
and it just doesn't look.
Right.
Like it has less detail. It's more animated.
I think you're both hitting on something really interesting. So this is so obviously framed, right? Like there's an intentionality behind it. I think that's what you're getting at in some sense, which makes it feel a little bit less authentic. But at the same time, you're right, Brittany, to say, and then I saw your hand, Billy, to say that somehow you get the sense that there's less detail in this, even though the photograph has so many pixels, right? So few pixels, I should say, that it's almost blurry, right? You don't see the details of the soldiers' faces. I assume that's a dirt trench of some kind. Like you don't actually know the details, and yet it feels more detailed and real than the painting, where you can actually see the blood and fire and wrinkles on the people's shirts. And so there's that kind of disconnect that's happening that I think both of you are really getting at. That's quite interesting. Yes, Billy.
I feel like the color's a different thing too. Like it's very bright compared to it, and then like someone coming out of the fire. Like I don't think that would be very realistic. Having someone coming out of the flames, and then like the colors just really kind of jump at you.
Yeah, that use of the term realistic is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because while we can technically identify this as realistic in the sense that it clearly is meant to represent a form of reality or a reality, the fact that it's so bright, like you say, in the center, which from a compositional perspective is meant to just draw your attention, of course, right? That's just a painting thing. But it removes that sense of realism, at least in the back of your mind, at the very least. Good. Yeah, Mark, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just kind of like the top one, I feel like sensationalized, and like it's what's the word when there's more? We're just trying to propaganda. It's propaganda to maybe inspire or just kind of say this is terrible and it's happening. We need help. Come help us. And this one, the lower one, is just kind of like this is what it's really like. It's not as spectacular. You're not going to die in a blaze of glory. Kind of.
Yeah, definitely. I like that use of the term spectacular. Yeah, especially with the guys with their eyes, with their arms way up, right? Right.
Well, it's just like it's the reality of war is that death isn't glamorous usually, and you're not always necessarily the hero. You're just going to be helping and dying. I mean, World War I and all wars, but like. The top one makes me feel like, oh, like if I go, it's going to be amazing. Even if I die, it's,
Definitely. So you're all, I think, getting at something that, at the very least, what you get as a sense from this photograph is that it's more, it's a more accurate portrayal. who said that it wasn't framed and staged.
I mean, especially in today's world, we question everything.
Right, we question
AI
everything.
made that
Yeah, exactly. AI made that picture. No, AI did not make this specific picture. But that instinct is a good one nonetheless, right? It's gotten normal for us to question certain pictures that don't fit what we would consider, right, accurate or true. Right? And I actually don't know if this picture is staged or not. I couldn't find that much information on it. But I do know that there are other pictures of that era that were. People were not above doing that. Right? And even the pictures that are described and photographs that are described in this in this text, a lot of them are staged. Right? The picture that's described in the epilogue. Robert sitting on a keg. Right? This is on a keg of water. This is at Lethbridge in the spring of 1915. Right? He would have been there intentionally. Someone would have taken the time to set up a camera, right? And cameras took a long time to produce their effect at the time. It's not like today where you can, again, take 24 images in a second. So you had to like really set it up and stay there. You decided to sit on that cake, you're going to be on that cake for the next half hour while I take this picture. Right? So there is a sense, inevitably, of staging in a lot of these pictures. So while it technically represents, in many ways, it's just as staged. It's just as fictional. But much like the structure of a narrative, it feels real. Does that change our perception of the photograph? What if it is staged? Look at it for a sec and think these guys stayed like that for a bit. Does that change how you feel about it? Or how you interpret it?
No, I still think it's more of an authentic portrayal of what it would have been.
Interesting. Why? I'm not saying you're wrong. I would agree with you at the end of the day that it still feels real. And it fits in with my idea of what the war would have looked like.
To me, it's like, even if it was staged, it still is showing that there is a conflict that is important happening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Good. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like even if it was, you're still getting the imagery of what war looks like for that.
Oh, good. Okay. It is, and in a way, it also is still more instantaneous. Even if it does take a long time, it's still more instant or closer to the moment, to come back to Findley's own use of that term, than a painting ever would be. Because still the painting would take weeks at the very least, and months if you're a regular painter. If not years. I don't remember when that photo was taken, when that painting was made.
Yeah, kind of just take it like if it was staged.
Yeah.
Like I said, like it still is showing people what's happening. Similar things have happened. Like, even the moon landing, they did recreations, and people today take it as like, oh, it's all fake. Look at this. It's on its sets, and it's like, of course they did do that, but they did that just to kind of give you a visual when they couldn't show you actually what's happening in space, right? Like, I know.
No, it's just really good. I love that conspiracy theory so much. I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all, but that one still grabs me so much. It's so hilarious. But yeah, no, absolutely. I guess that does tie in. So we talked about these two. It does tie in also to a moment when Ross burns the photo of Rowena. In the most literal sense of what we as moderns have left of that time, right? At the end of the day, the archivist is creating story based off of what she has, right? So, considering what we just talked about with photographs versus paintings and what's left to us, why would it be important for Findley to emphasize the fact that Robert burns the photo of his sister? What does that signify to us? Either for him as a character, or his interest in the narrative, or in history, etc. What does that ring as a bell?
Kind of felt like it was him letting go.
Okay. So for the character, you mean?
Yeah,
Mhm.
like for him to kind of just let go of that painful memory. Kind of like, if we break up with someone, we'll delete their photos.
Oh yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah. Although you'll crop them out.
Yeah. Cut them out of it.
Yeah.
Burn it.
We're petty exes, is what we're saying. Yeah. Okay. So there is that sense of belonging, right, or beholding that you kind of want to burn away. You hear that sometimes in certain stories, or even people talking about that, of even if it's technically a light thing, right, of it being a burden, right, in their pocket or something like that, because you know that it's there. Right?
I was gonna say that like internal battle, like out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
It says in the book that burning her photograph is a charity, an act of charity.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's trying to, like, mentally save this part of him from going back to the front lines.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. So in burning the picture of Rowena, she is no longer the thing driving him. Okay, I see what you mean. Right. Okay.
Or maybe with the way I took what you said was that there was that innocence part that's tied to Rowena, and he wanted to leave that innocent part in a safe space and not bring it with him to where he was going.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that. Yeah.
Because he was no longer, as he's killed, and I can't remember when he burned the photo.
Yeah, I wrote it down somewhere. It was if anyone has it off the top of their head, it was towards the end. But when exactly, I can't for the life of me remember. Okay, these are all really good. I'm coming to the end of what I wanted to talk about, so if anyone has any final questions or anything like that, feel free.
It was right after he was raped.
It was right after. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Before he went back to the front lines.
Yeah, Robert burned it in the middle of the floor. This was not an act of anger, but an act of charity. Yeah. And that's how the chapter ends. So, right, his own sexual innocence as well, right, just before that is destroyed. And so to tie into what you were saying, Mark, that familial innocence is also then completely...
I'm also thinking of another scenario for that now, like that. He just didn't want Rowena to see that, and she was with him in that, so he left her there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I never thought of that, but yeah, this whole idea of, even if she obviously wasn't physically there, right? The memory of her, right? I no longer have it, but the memory of her, the ghost of her in that metaphorical sense, was still there through the photograph as he was completely losing
that's
the sense
what I
of
meant.
self. Okay, that is what you. Okay.
Part of himself that he holds that's Rowena in his mind.
Okay, I see. I didn't understand. Sorry. Okay, yeah.
We got there in the end.
We got there, ladies and gentlemen. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. I'll ask you the same thing that I asked you about Angélique, which was our other longer text. Did we enjoy this novel or like reading it? Like reading it is a big term. Again. Yeah, I know you did. No, it's fine because you told me about it. Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
It was okay.
Yeah.
What didn't you like about it?
Like the other one, at least I was grasped and I was like indulged in the book. This one, I couldn't stay focused. I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
I had a hard time getting into it.
Okay.
I couldn't.
Interesting. So, like the prose and the actual narrative just didn't grab you as much. You're nodding your head, Moon, as well. It just wasn't the same. Oh, interesting. Okay. Billy, do you agree? Okay, nodding your head. All right.
I just was trying to see who was.
Basically, most of the class thought it was okay.
Here's my question and challenge. That's like,
Yeah.
I'm a man, and that maybe more resonates with me.
Mhm.
You have a husband who's in the military. You like it. You know, there's some kind of correlation with that. And then Angelique was more of a women's rights type.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I don't know.
Because it resonates
You
more.
liked it? You don't even
I
read
like
it.
both.
Ladies, what do you think of that
It's a
interpretation?
human story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. You've been
I
shot
do.
down, Mark. You're wrong.
I do. I mean, I also
I'm
have
kidding.
like
Just saying. I'm trying to get participation.
No, it's fine.
I also am a history major, so like
Yeah.
I'm interested in history, and I just did the history club trip, so I was just at the Meningate and at Eton and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It would hit me different.
Sure. But I do agree that it is. Angelique is certainly a narrative that wants you to think of both race and gender and class, right? It explicitly wants you to think of that. I do agree that while that is present in Findley's novel, it does have the feeling that it's not as much about those relations necessarily, and they're more tangential to a broader point that they're making. Although obviously masculinity is a part of it. Yeah. No, I know YouTube is tracking me, dude. I don't need a notification for that. Stop it. So, good. We're coming up to the end of class here, and I wanted to take a few minutes because... Oh, no, I don't have it on this one. Obviously, we were supposed to do one different narrative for today, right? But we decided to extend, or I decided to extend the wars into 2 classes. Okay? So that means, of course, we're going to have to rearrange the schedule somewhat. Okay? What I was thinking for at least this week, and we'll see about next week, is to continue basically as we had planned, right? And drop Larissa Lai and Rita Wong's Civil Unrest that was supposed to be on Thursday. Right? So basically tomorrow do what we were supposed to do today, and Thursday do what we were supposed to do tomorrow. Right? Just basically shift from one. Okay? Does that make sense for everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. So tomorrow, Michael Ondaatje's Collected Works of Billy the Kid. Just an excerpt of a wider text. It's like 20 pages that I gave you. And I think it complements this really well, except from a poetry perspective. Okay? And more emphasis on the photographs, but explicitly they're like printed on so we can talk about that, of course. And of course, a completely different character. And what was I going to say? Are we still okay with doing the Marrow Thieves on next Monday? Because like seeing how many of you managed to finish the wars, I'm wondering if I just do 2 classes automatically for the Marrow Thieves. Probably. Okay. But we still want to do it.
Yeah.
It is a lighter, I don't know if we could say it's a lighter novel. It's an easier read. The subject matter is as difficult in many ways, but it's the narrative flow is much more linear, much more conventional from a narrative, from a novel. It's about the same length.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is Angelique going to be using the essay for English?
Usually for the essays, it's the same instructions as last week, except longer. So you come up with your own thesis statement and argument. And the idea was that you try to write it about one of the things from that week. Okay. So for this week, it would be the wars, Billy the Kid, and Tanya Tagak on Thursday. Okay, those are your options. I'm flexible on that, but that was the idea, right? Was that you write an essay for something from that week. that answer your question?
Just like for next week or
Mhm.
whatever. But since you don't have the exam like done yet, do you think you're gonna have a class designated for like review and stuff? Okay, you do.
Yes, the last class is designated for review. Yeah, both of like some of the theoretical terms that we've been playing with, and the novels or the texts more broadly. Yes,
I had a random question.
Yeah.
Nothing really pertaining to this, but for the exam, is it
The best
gonna
kind
be,
of
like,
questions.
multiple choice or not multiple choice, like multiple questions you can pick one, or is it like you have one question you have to answer?
there's different kinds of questions. I haven't finished the exam yet, but I've been writing it as we've been doing the class so that the questions are fresh in my mind.
Well, if you like choose like 2 out of 5 kind of thing.
So far, and I'll be repeating this for sure, but so far there are 3 parts to the exam: short questions, passage identifications, and a longer development that will be an option. Like you'll have a few different options to write a development question from.
Like you'll write a passage. I mean, there will be a passage, and we have to say where it's from.
Yes, that's the passage identification one. It should be pretty, like, I think so far each of the works are different enough that you shouldn't have too much of a difficulty identifying where the work is from. Even if you haven't finished something like The Wars, I still think Findley's writing style is distinctive enough that if I do put a passage from him, you might probably identify it. Yeah. We'll talk about it on the actual day, but yeah, feel free to ask. I'm dodgy with the questions just because it's not a fixed exam yet, but that's what I'm thinking of.
I mean, it's hard because you don't know, like, we have to cut something already, so you can't just.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm cutting civil unrest because we're also talking about Obasan on the week after, so I figured like there was some overlap between the two, so it makes sense to do that. Yeah, go ahead, Ibube. Yeah.
And we definitely
No. It's a good question because in my other classes, I've mentioned this outside of regular class hours to some people who asked. I'm not used to actually having to follow this rigid of a structure for my classes, right? As far as the types of evaluations are concerned. In my classes in Montreal, I can basically do whatever the hell I want. And I usually don't actually do exams because I find them tedious. But yes, I am obligated to do exams as per department regulations.
Sure, throw Brandon University out.
I am absolutely throwing Brandon University under the bus. I understand why people do them. I genuinely do. It's just not for me personally. I think there are better ways to evaluate student understanding, namely through essays and creative writings. But yeah, I have to do 3 essays or writing prompts, and I have to do 1 exam, even if it is an intensive class. I already got away with allowing you to do a creative option, and that was pushing it. No. Yes, really. I'm glad I took like 25 minutes to do this. Yeah, go ahead.
Were you supposed to do it on like the Monday? Like,
Yes.
There's no.
That I could not decide when that was. They told me like your exam is on June 22nd.
And you couldn't switch.
No.
Well, promise you.
I'm sorry, guys. My hands are quite literally tied. If you want to complain to the dean or whoever. Yep. No worries. Any other questions or concerns?
That would be really fun, writing your math essays.
Oh yeah, you're gonna have a blast.
That's so fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I am well aware that it's an exam from 6 to 9, and that English is not most of your majors or none of your majors, right? So like I do get it, and I will be making the exam accordingly, right? So to the point where I will ask you questions based off of what we talked about, but they're not going to be questions that are meant to trap you, right? Or to just me being like, haha, you all suck at English analysis. Like, obviously not, right? So I will be generous in that sense. Mostly that's for my own ego and to appear magnanimous towards my students. Yeah.
Writing like a long answer, like an essay answer, is like always so much harder by hand, right? Like, I have a hard time understanding how much of it because like is my writing big? Is my You know what I mean? Is it like really only half the age, or
Yeah.
it's hard to write those?
I have to remember actually. I'll be giving you some space on the actual exam to write out the development question. I think I'll limit the development question to like 5 to 750, like the first essay. So like again, quality over quantity here. That's just like an average. I don't know if you'll actually have time. I'm thinking of this. I see your face, Lee. I'm well aware. This is just like thoughts. Okay. Maybe I will lower it. Probably I will. Okay. But I mustn't forget to bring some like extra loose leaves for people who do actually write more. So I'll take a note of that. Yes, go ahead.
Like if you want like 700 words of like handwritten words from me, it's gonna get nasty because when I write fast, it just gets worse.
Yeah, same. Yeah, we're not used to writing by hand anymore, just in general. Yeah, as evidenced by this awful handwriting. That I promise my handwriting is better in real life. Yeah. I used to get cramps with when I was writing by hand just because I wasn't used to it anymore. But
I'm left-handed, so it always smears.
okay, bring a pen. Bring a pen in that case, as much as possible. Yeah.
I also think that's
Anxiety?
Like I
Yeah.
for myself doing exams and you're writing English.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes like I just isn't exactly.
Yeah.
I
think-
don't do the elements.
I think if there's one thing that you should learn from me is that I shouldn't cause too much anxiety. Just as a person and a teacher, I think I'm pretty flexible for that. So that may alleviate some anxiety, but I don't. Maybe not. Maybe it's just exams in general, like you're saying.
Do you
Yeah.
require the exam you written pen and pencil from your own?
Like, what are the alternatives?
Typically, our other professors say you have to write it in pen. So I was just curious.
Oh,
Are okay with being in pencils? I feel like it's
I don't care if it's in pencil as long as it's clear.
yeah.
If after your first sentence or two you realize that you're smudging all over the place, I will force you to write by pen. Yeah, because I don't want to give you a bad grade just because I can't read your handwriting. Yeah.
I don't like pen because I'll start like maybe a paragraph and then realize I don't like what I'm writing. So then
No, for sure. So that's why I'll bring some loose leaf if you do want to draft your papers. Yeah, go ahead.
Or maybe be like a word.
Pages is a little bit easier.
Pages is a little bit easier, but again, my priority is that you answer the question clearly and coherently rather than filling out an actual word count. Yeah.
Let's not overthink it.
Yeah, please don't overthink it. I'm not going to overthink it. You shouldn't overthink it.
Well, we are.
Yeah, I know. I'm encouraging you not to.
You're not
Okay.
going to take every word. You're like one.
Oh God, no.
You got the teeth counter going.
No. If you want to write the word count at the end, you can, but I don't care. I genuinely don't care.
499
Yeah.
words.
Fail immediately. It's a pass or fail exam actually. So if you don't reach the 500, it's over. Any other questions?
So if I just write blah blah blah.
Yeah, then we're getting into the content element. It's a bit dicey. Okay, so last thing, and then I'll leave you unless there's any other questions. But if you haven't yet checked it out for Billy the Kid, it's technically on today's class in the Moodle, right? It's in class 6. I think I'll shift it over just to like rearrange the Moodle. But so if you're looking later tomorrow and it's not in class 6 where it usually would, just look in class 7. Okay, so it'll be somewhere on the Moodle, even if it's not in today's class where it technically was supposed to be. Okay? Same thing for all the other stuff.
Does that mean you're going to delete the one that you don't want us to read?
No, it'll be the civil unrest.
Yeah.
I can leave it up if you want, but
Label it optional.
yeah, I'll leave it on optional, but it won't really fit in with the Tanya Tagak and Rudy Weeb text, so I'll put it there if you're interested, but it won't be on the exam necessarily. Yeah. Any other questions? Concerns? Comments? Insults? All right. Have a lovely evening. I'll see you tomorrow for Michael Ondaatje's The Collected Works of Billy the Kid.